Looking good. And
I'm just going
everybody,
to stop there, Hank. Sorry.
you bet. Okay, I'm going to run with it then. So, in essence, tonight we're going to walk you through a story about polar bears in a warming Arctic. And I'm going to try to provide you a broad background about polar bears as an Arctic icon, and particularly an icon of climate change. I'm going to talk a bit about research, polar bear ecology and evolution, changes in sea ice, that's where polar bears live. And then I'm going to talk about some of the implications for polar bears as the Arctic is warming. So it's pretty free-ranging. There's not a lot of data in this, but I think being Canadian, most of us are pretty darn familiar with polar bears as a species. You only have to flip over a $2 coin to see a picture of one. And so in some respects, polar bears don't really need any introduction to Canadians in particular. But it goes deeper than that, and this is some Inuit art. And I just sort of acknowledge that when it comes to polar bears, this is a culturally important species, particularly for Inuit in the Canadian North, but Greenlandic people and Inupiat in Alaska as well, and to some extent in Eastern Russia for the Chukotkin people. So again, when you think about polar bears, we think about them as this interesting species in a natural history perspective, or at least I do. But for northern people, of course, they're hunted. We still harvest about 500 polar bears in the Canadian Arctic every year. It's an indigenous-led hunt, mainly by Inuit, but some Cree hunters as well. And those bears are typically eaten. The hides are sold. They can be sold internationally under a trading agreement that Canada has. And again, it's a really culturally important thing. So harvesting a polar bear is a great sort of celebration, and it's a major component of what happens in these small communities. But from a more Eurocentric perspective, when you sort of get back down to it, this is, of course, the Tower of London. And in 1252, King Henry III received a polar bear from the King of Norway, Håkon the Fourth. So this bear was actually kept at the Tower of London, as probably many of you know. That was actually a menagerie that was full of different animals from all over the world. But the polar bear was seen as a prize species, and it has that sort of reputation going back deep in time of being a very prized animal. And so within that context, this is what an artist's installation sort of envisioned a polar bear at the Tower of London looked like. This is, of course, this one you can see it's chained up. But the story was that it used to be taken down to the Thames to fish. I think they probably just took it down there to go for a swim. But polar bears are extremely easy to train, so it's quite likely this bear was happily skipping about in London at the time. And so, again, from this construct of sort of being a cultural icon, it's also an artistic icon. And this is the L'Ours Blanc from Musée d'Orsay in Paris, a very stylized looking bear, of course. And in this context, wherever I go in the world, I see polar bears, and not real ones, but from an artistic perspective, they show up in our advertising all over the place. You can't imagine the number of places that polar bears have been used. So Coca-Cola is a pretty standard one, but they've been used to sell Volkswagens. Beer is pretty common. Polar beer sounds good, and there's lots of people that sell that. Oil, mittens. I always like the one about, selling mittens and for polar bears. Coleman's mustard, I don't know. That polar bear obviously has a toothache. Cigarettes as well. So it's a species that people recognize. And if you actually talk to people around the world, it's one of the species that people would like to see, no matter where they are. It's one of the top 10, lions, giraffes, zebras, elephants, but polar bears are always right up in there. And again, this is, it's an evening talk, so I can sort of put it in perspective, but I always like the one of the bears all enjoying a nice cold beer, fresh and cold, direct from the North Pole, or if Campari's more your deal. You get the idea. It's something that everybody knows. I really like this one. This is an old white bear coffee, 1 pound of coffee. And I mean, I just kind of think about, who dreamed up the marketing for this. That that's how we're going to sell coffee. We're going to picture of a polar bear on it, the cover with a dead seal. But it obviously did some good. For those of you that maybe grew up with some of these books, because some of these have been around a long time, or have read them to children or grandchildren. We certainly had these all in the house. But again, it's something that is culturally infused into people, from books for children to movies. You can go to see IMAX films about polar bears. It's pretty much almost everywhere you want to go. There's something to be seen about polar bears in sort of a cultural perspective. So again, if you're musically inclined, you can actually go online and download a copy of the Polar Bear Polka from 1856. I think I've never actually found somebody who could play the music for this. I never inflicted that on my children, even though they could play instruments. But it's the idea that this is a cultural species that we're well familiar with. So I'm going to transition now and talk about what I do when I'm not teaching at the university. And I've caught a lot of polar bears over the years across various parts of the Canadian Arctic, and in the Norwegian Arctic as well. And so we've had research going on. And it's interesting, I'll just note, Edmonton has actually been the hub of polar bear research going back over 50 years now. And the first graduate from the University of Alberta was actually in 1970 studying polar bears. So right back into the very earliest days of research, University of Alberta has been there. It's also because Environment and Climate Change Canada has a long-running program of polar bear research here with Ian Sterling, who just passed away this last year. So this is what I spend a lot of time doing and looking for. That arrow is pointing to a polar bear out on the sea ice. They're not easy to find. Typically, what we do is we are flying in a helicopter, we find tracks, and then if we follow them long enough, usually there's a polar bear at the end of the tracks. And so in a bit more dynamic perspective, what it looks like, this is from a couple of years ago, out on the sea ice of Hudson Bay, working just to the east and north of Churchill. And we've got a polar bear there that is basically right there, and we're banking around. We'll come around. There's enough ice here, we can catch this bear. If you look sort of down below that red arrow, you'll see a big red sort of dirty piece of ice out there. So what happened there is a seal has been killed there recently, and this bear was probably drifting by to see if there was something to eat. This is when we get a bit more down low and personal with the bears. And what's going on here is we've got the door off the helicopter. I'm sitting right behind the pilot. And you can see this bear has already got one immobilizing dart up in the base of his neck. And he's big enough that he's going to need a second dart, and then he'll go to sleep. It takes about 5 to 7 minutes before they're out and safe to approach. We land, and then we can come and do the science sort of side of what we do. So there's a lot of things we measure with these bears. And one of the things we look at are things like the breakage on their canines. The breakage is really common with these animals. When they're fighting in the springtime during the mating period, the big males are basically slamming together. And if they hit the wrong way, they snap their canines. It's pretty grim, the damage they can do to each other. This is, again, a slightly different size bear. This cub is just about 4 months old at this point, and this one's not drugged at this point, but its mother is drugged. Yeah, you have to drug the mother, and then you can drug the cubs. This cub ran away, and I had to go run it down and bring it back to its mom, so we could process her. And so in that processing, there's a lot of different things. I won't go into the details, but we collect biological samples, and like for instance, we take blood, hair, fat, skin. Sometimes we collect milk as well, depending on the nature of the study that we're doing. We have in Western Hudson Bay, we have a really big pedigree of bears. We know over 4,000 different individuals that have been caught there over time. And so we have DNA samples from each of those animals in our archives. We do a standard bunch of morphometric measurements. Here I'm just measuring the head length and head width. And it's basically telling us what the growth responses of the bears are over time. We can age the bears. We pull a small premolar tooth about the size of a cribbage peg, and then we take it to the lab, thin section it, and we count the rings like a tree. So we can look at age-specific growth rates for the bears. And it's interesting. I first started working in this population in 1984. And the adult females that are in this population now, from tip of nose to tip of tail, are somewhere around 15 centimeters shorter. They used to be about 210 centimeters long. Now they're somewhere in the 190s. So they're actually getting smaller as the environmental conditions are changing. So one of the nice things about working on polar bears is you get to live in these really luxurious places. This is up in the Beaufort Sea, not too far from the town of Pawatuck. It's actually a small trapper's cabin that we're based in. It was pretty crappy weather that day. This is even further north. This is on the north end of Banks Island. So that's the western end of the Northwest Passage. And then this is a weird one. We were up there doing polar bear work. It's April. It should be incredibly cold, but as you can see, the helicopter's all covered up and we've got icicles on the building. It was actually raining up there at that time, which is not exactly the conditions you want when you're studying polar bears. When I worked in Norway, it was really cool. As you can see, that's a younger version of me without the beard. And we had our own icebreaker. So we actually, I could tell the icebreaker where we wanted to go. And this is actually, at this point, we're actually in Russian territory. And the researcher in the middle is a Russian colleague. So anyways, we're studying them everywhere. Now, it's funny, the older I get, the cushier I like it. This is our base of operations in Churchill, Manitoba, the Churchill Northern Study Center. For those of you that are interested in seeing polar bears, there are tours that are run from the study center through the Elder Hostel program. And they're quite good. They get you out there, and it's a little bit cheaper than going the commercial route there. It's pretty sweet here. We just pull up our helicopter right in front of where we're sleeping and can load up and take off in the day. Um, I have to say that I first went out on the sea ice in the 80s and I thought it was the most desolate environment I'd ever been in. And that's probably because a lot of the life in the Arctic is, except for polar bears and Arctic fox and, the occasional ptarmigan at this latitude and a few ravens, most of the life is, of course, under the sea ice. And that's where all the action is in this system. But it's an incredibly beautiful place. This is in the Beaufort Sea. This is about 2 o'clock in the morning after the weather had cleared. And we were out looking for polar bears in the middle of the night with this beautiful midnight sun. And so we're not too far from Tuktoyaktuk, if you know where that is. Hudson Bay, this image is not the sort of ice conditions we want. Hudson Bay is a very dynamic area, and it's the place where we're currently conducting research here. This is not a place where I could catch a bear. We have to get out beyond this band of light ice to where we've got solid ice where we can do our studies. So where do the bears come from? We've got 8 species of bears in the world right now. Of course, the one that diverged earliest was the giant panda, but polar bears and grizzly bears are very closely related. Then we've got the other North American bear, the American black bear, and then sort of the tropical bears for the most part in Asia, and one bear in South America, the spectacled bear. So this is not a polar bear, but most Albertans recognize that. This is Ursus arctos, the grizzly bear. And in this perspective, what we've got is a brown terrestrial omnivore. These bears eat almost anything in their environment. And it's basically in a relatively short period of time, somewhere between, I'd say, about 500,000, probably to 1,000,000 years, maybe some estimates as much as 5 million years. This is what happened. Polar bears moved out onto the sea ice, became white, they became marine, and they became an obligate predator. And we're going to go through that predation component. Now, if you go to Churchill, you see bears on land, but if in reality, polar bears would far rather spend their life out on the sea ice and that's where their primary habitat is. Now, in that separation, there's a lot of changes that have occurred in the skull shape and the dentition. Polar bears' teeth are moving back to a more carnivorous style. The skull shape has elongated and it's flattened, not as domed as a grizzly bear. But nonetheless, I teach mammalogy at the university, and we go through these sorts of things in much more detail. But if you get down to the base of the bear, looking at the feet and the claws, if you're looking at a grizzly bear foot, it's not haired compared to a polar bear paw, which makes sense. The hair provides traction, but it also provides warmth. And of course, the claws are dramatically different. I mean, grizzly bears have claws that are built for excavation, whereas those claws of a polar bear are incredibly sharp and are used for gripping prey, but also providing traction on slippery surfaces. So the other thing that I can't really show in a picture is that if you went to the Arctic right now, the high Arctic, and went to look for a barren ground grizzly bear, or actually even into the mountains in Alberta, you can't find one at this time of year. They're all hibernating. And so one of the big differences between polar bears and grizzly bears is that polar bears are active all through the winter period, out on the sea ice hunting, and then in the spring is their prime feeding and mating period, and that's just when grizzly bears are coming out of their dens. So grizzly bears in the Arctic, I've studied them up around Nunavik. Those bears are going into dens in November, and they don't come out until May. And that's actually the whole window of time that polar bears are making their living. So it's a very different lifestyle between the bears. We do have expanding populations of grizzly bears across Canada. We're now seeing them in Churchill, Manitoba. And you didn't hear it from me, but there's a report of one in Ontario now. So they're slowly expanding their range. Some places they're recolonizing. Other places we don't really have records of them being there. This is a grizzly bear up in the north end of Banks Island. Eventually, I caught this bear. It's immobilized here. We had permits to do this. This is all done under permits. We caught this bear, and this is the famous area where some people have heard about hybrid polar bear grizzly bears. Some people call them Pisleys or Growler bears. I just call them hybrids. But this is what a hybrid looks like. This photo was taken by a former graduate student of mine, Jody Pongrass. This is actually on Victoria Island, so right up in the Northwest Passage, just next to Banks Island, a little further east. She's half polar bear and half grizzly bear. And what you don't see in this photo is that it's a breeding season, and she's actually being courted by a male grizzly bear. Not the one in the photo I had, but a different one that was living in this area. And what we know happened is the next year, she shows up and she's got now 3/4 grizzly bear cubs and 1/4 polar bear cubs. Now, we've done genetic examinations of polar bears and grizzly bears in this area, and there's not many hybrids. And as it turned out, it was only one female polar bear that on two separate occasions mated with a grizzly bear. That's where all the hybrids came from. Most of those hybrids have now, that we know of, have been harvested by local people, mainly on Victoria Island. But one of the things that I often hear about, people talking about climate change and the effects, they always say, well, won't the bears just become more terrestrial? And I'm hopefully going to dispel that myth. We don't really undo evolutionary time, not when the environment is moving as quickly forward in terms of the warming that we're seeing. So we're not going to change things like that. There's just too many fundamental changes between these two species. Yes, they can hybridize, but hybrids are common. I mean, we get mule deer and whitetail in Alberta. We get lynx and bobcat, coyotes and wolves. Hybrids are not uncommon in natural systems. It just means that those two species haven't been separated long enough in time. It takes about 5 million years of good separation. But grizzly bears and polar bears keep sort of bumping into each other. And I mean that in the sense of mating. And so we get this sort of overlap. But just as an example of some of the difference, that little cub that down is at the back end of the mom with the milky mustache, Polar bears don't even have mammary glands down there anymore. So grizzly bears, following the sort of mammalian rule of two mammae per um, individual offspring, female grizzly bears have six functional mammae. Polar bears with a smaller litter size only have four functional mammae. So this is pretty typical, 1 to 2 cubs, sometimes triplets, but pretty uncommon. And when you see triplets, we usually call them 2.5 cubs because there's usually a really runty one. So in common with grizzly bears, the cubs stay with their mother for 2.5 years, and this results in slow population growth. So this female in the middle, she's wearing a satellite collar. We are tracking about 10 polar bears in Hudson Bay by satellite collar and some other tracking. And if you're really interested, you can follow my Twitter account. I put out the maps of where the bears are once a week. But these cubs are just coming up to their second birthday. And it's really interesting because this mother is still actually nursing her cubs. And I've seen out in the fall around Churchill where you've got a cub that's just 2 years old, is actually bigger than the mother, but is still nursing from her, getting a little bit of energy at that time. It's a species with a very long lifespan, 24 to 28 years. This is an old male polar bear. You can tell he's old. I mean, the hip bones are sticking out. There's not much chance that, anybody would buy a horse that looked like this. And this guy's on his way out. He's in his early 20s. And part of the big impact for polar bears is that the mating season overlaps perfectly with the prime feeding period for hunting for seals. And so one of the things that happens is a lot of these male bears put all of their effort into trying to mate and don't put as much effort into trying to feed. And that's one of the mortality factors is they get in poor condition and then they basically run out of energy. And we'll look at why that is so critically important in just a little while here. So basically, sea ice is the primary habitat for polar bears. It's where they travel, it's where they hunt, and basically it's the environment that really works to keep them around. If you look at where polar bears are, they're only existing where sea ice persists for most of the year. And that's because they use it for hunting. They mate out on the sea ice. If you go off the coast of Alaska, historically at least, we used to have females digging maternity dens out on the sea ice and giving birth to cubs there. So if you went back into the 1980s and earlier, we had polar bears that were born on the sea ice, lived on the sea ice, and died on the sea ice, and they never came onto land. They didn't have to, and they didn't really want to either. So not everybody's familiar with sea ice as a habitat, so I put this in. Most of us are in Alberta, we're all familiar with river ice and lake ice, but it's a vastly different ecosystem. And one of the things that happens is that when sea ice is forming in the fall, we get something called brines formation. And as that ice is forming, the salt in the water is actually ejected and it sort of rains out of the ice. And as it does that, it creates these little microtubules in the ice, these little tiny channels. And it's a very different, like sea ice is actually quite bendable. You get on ice, you can walk on it and it bends. Freshwater ice, as we know, if you walk on it, it's too thin, it just fractures. So it's a much more plastic environment. But the key for marine ecosystems is the sea ice is almost akin to soil in a terrestrial ecosystem. It's the base of the whole ecosystem community that polar bears and the whole marine system relies on. So one of the things that happens in these microtubules is we've got algae that are growing there, and then we've got algal mats that form underneath the ice and grow. And that's the source of our primary productivity. And then on top of that, there's a whole community that lives associated with the sea ice. And so some colleagues of mine did some work on looking at certain markers in this algae. This is what we call epontic algae growing under the sea ice. And these algal mats, actually, the energy in those forms up to 100% of the diet of polar bears. So it moves through the food web up to a polar bear, and most of that energy is associated with this ice algae. It's not like open water ice or algae that's growing. It's this apontic algae under the surface. And of course, how does it get into a polar bear? Well, first it has to go through, these are amphipods and copepods, and these are the grazers, and there's a whole other community of invertebrates that live underneath and associated with this sea ice. And these species are specific to sea ice. Most of these species rely on the presence of sea ice, or other species would live there, such as the ones we see in the North Atlantic and North Pacific. And this little critter is the polar cod. Sometimes people call it the Arctic cod. This is an incredibly abundant little fish. It's only about yay long. They're not incredibly big, but they're incredibly abundant. And this species only exists where sea ice is found. And this is the link between the lower trophic levels and up to birds and the seals that then, of course, particularly the seals, end up being the food of a polar bear. So this is sort of what we would call a keystone species in Arctic marine systems. Take away the ice, there's be an ecosystem, it just won't include these species. So this is what I call the small meal deal and the big meal deal. The small meal deal is a ring seal that goes up to about 70 kilos. This is the bread and butter of polar bears. These are the two species that all polar bears rely on for at least the majority of their diet. Ring seals are upwards to about 70 kilos, bearded seals up to over 450 kilos. Ring seals numbering in the many millions, bearded seals in the hundreds of thousands. But one of the tricks here for Arctic ecosystems is both of these species are only found where sea ice exists. And once you don't have sea ice, well, then you see other seal species that live in those areas. So they use the sea ice for giving birth to their pups. They use it for molting and hauling out. So it's an essential part of their life. So this is a happy polar bear to some extent. Killed a seal. It's ripping it open. This is what I call the peeling the banana type of approach. They open them up. And fortunately for this bear, this seal is not particularly fat. This is a much better deal for a polar bear. I hope nobody's squeamish and just ate dinner, but what's happened, I know this was killed by an adult male polar bear, and then basically what he's done is what I call the Oreo cookie effect. They're not really interested in the cookie at all, which would be the meat down below or the skin up above. What they're really interested in is that white layer, and that's the blubber of seals. And in essence, you can think about polar bears as just being a fat vacuum. They just walk around the Arctic, killing seals, ripping them open, scrape off that icing, and then move along, eat another one, and keep going. And you don't have to do a lot of that to really make a good living. And a polar bear in a single meal can eat up to 20% of its body mass. So a male polar bear, 500 kilograms in its own mass, could easily consume upwards of 100 kilograms of seal fat. So again, you feel bad, you ate that bag of chips, you probably shouldn't have, it's going right to my waist, but for polar bears, that's exactly the game plan they want. So if they manage to get a meal, kill a bearded seal, strip off 100 kilograms of fat, they're going to deposit about 94 kilograms of that fat directly into their own fat cells. So their adipocytes basically are like little balloons of fat, and they just fill up when they get a meal. It's almost unmodified from the seal. It just goes into the stomach, into the bloodstream, into these fat cells, and they just bloom like that. And that's a pretty good system. So you can see you may not have to kill a lot of seals in a year, but when you do, it quite often is a very significant energetic return. Just roughly, it'd be about the equivalent of 1,000 Big Mac meals. I'm not going to make any comments about McDonald's and the US election, but anyways, maybe I should replace that with something more Canadian like Tim Hortons. Mind you, that's I think old by Americans too now. Anyways, I digress. It's really for polar bears, it is the survival of the fattest. And in that context, what we've got here is when we catch a bear, we rank them from 1 to 5. 1 is really skinny, like the bear on the bottom. That bear is not long for this world. It's really running out of energy. And the two bears on the top that look kind of like light bulbs, they're both going to be pregnant females. The pregnant females are sort of the winning in the sort of the fattest award bear contest. A female polar bear can easily deposit 200 or 300 kilograms of body fat that it's going to use to go into a den over winter, give birth to cubs, and then nurse them until they come out in the springtime. So, in essence, a female polar bear in Hudson Bay can go 8 months, and over that 8 months, she will eat absolutely nothing. She'll use that stored fat to give birth to her cubs, then nurse them on incredibly fat-rich milk. And the cubs are born just about the size of a guinea pig, just about 800 grams, so just incredibly small. But to go for 240 days without feeding, she needs somewhere between 200 and 300 kilograms of stored body fat to do that. And they do it. I once caught 1985, I think it was. I caught a female. She weighed over 400 kilos. We caught her the year before. She weighed 100 kilos. She was a bone rack, but she just plumped up, had a good year feeding. She went on, she actually had triplets. So in essence, female polar bears can get up to 400 plus kilos. Males can hit 800. Neither of these bears are in that size range, but it gives you a sense of the dimorphism in the species. The males are typically about 2 times the size of females. Here she's just protecting her cub from a male that's come too close. But the whole essence of being a polar bear is they feed in this incredibly rich period in the springtime, and no polar bear ever looked at its reflection in a melt pond out on the sea ice and said, I'm too fat. They just don't work that way. Some of these females at peak body condition are so fat they can barely move, and they certainly can't run. So a little bit of the background on them, and this is sort of one of the questions in my research group that we spend a lot of time studying, which is polar bears live where sea ice persists for most of the year. But the big question for us is just what is most mean? How many days of sea ice and how many days without sea ice can they persist? And so we're going to talk a bit about this and sort of the implications for climate change for the bears. But again, where do polar bears live? Well, it's interesting. Most people say, well, they're an Arctic species. Well, they actually live in the subarctic as well. And so if you look at this, that red line actually put polar bears as far south as London in the United Kingdom. So they go very far south. They get right down into the northern parts of Labrador, not as consistently, but there's a population of bears that lives in James Bay. And myself and several other colleagues, we just are starting a big study of the polar bears down there. There's not a lot of bears in that area, but they're quite unique genetically, the most southernmost population, and definitely one that's being affected by climate change. But on the other end of the spectrum, we also have polar bears up to the Arctic Ocean. So this is right up to the North Pole. They don't really live there, but they cross over. We've had bears go right across the pole. Mainly where they want to be is in these darker areas, darker purple areas, where they're along the continental shelf. Why there? It's because marine productivity is higher, seal abundance is higher, and it's where they can make a living. And one of the challenges for polar bears in a warming world is that when we think about how species are going to respond to warming, they can move in latitudinal directions northward or southward, depending on the hemisphere, or in mountainous areas, they can move up in elevation. The problem for polar bears is that we can't really push them any farther north. Once we push them outside of that dark purple area, we're pushing them into the Arctic Ocean and the polar basin, and we go from water that's around 200 meters deep to water that's 2,000 to 3,000 meters deep. That is incredibly poor for biological productivity. And we're not going to end up with a lot of bears in those high latitude areas. There's not many bears there now. And the growing season is going to be short, even though we're probably going to have sea ice out as far as we can see into the future at those latitudes. the growing season is very short up that far north. So this is just what it looks like, Hudson Bay. This is just some tracking data. We are following bears. This is from 2017. Just to sort of give you a perspective, Hudson Bay is about 800 kilometers east to west and about 800 kilometers north to south. We're just coming up into the fall. The ice is forming. And these collars are giving us about 6 locations per day. And now the bears are dancing around out in the middle of the bay. Some years they go further north, some years further east. This is a fairly typical sort of distribution. The bears spread out. And then eventually we're now into the springtime. We're starting to see a little bit more open water showing up. The bears are coming back towards Churchill. Polar bears are real homebodies. They come back to where they were born, and they show really high fidelity to coming back to those places that they know. So once the ice is melting out, we're now into June. The last bits of ice is forming, and then the bears jump off the sea ice and come on to land where they were. So again, one of the things that people often say, well, with climate change, won't the bears just go north? Well, there's no sort of rule book for a bear that says they couldn't go north. They just don't. The bears have very strong sight fidelity. They go back to what they know year after year after year. And what we're seeing is not sort of movements. A polar bear born in Hudson Bay will likely die in southern Hudson Bay or near Churchill. They don't go. Some, of course, do over long sort of evolutionary time spans, but they don't really leave. So it's a climate change icon. And this really took off in the early 2000s. Myself and colleagues published a paper in 2004 about polar bears and climate change, and that got picked up by conservation groups. And polar bears have had this interesting tussle between sort of like the climate change groups that say the world isn't warming to groups that want to use polar bears as an icon of climate change. And the science sort of falls somewhere in the middle. And so one of the things that many of my colleagues worked on from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is in 2008, they were petitioned to look at the status of polar bears, and they concluded after all their analyses that they were a threatened species, and they predicted a 66% decline in the global population over 40 years. So the issue here is in Canada, polar bears aren't quite hitting that threatened species. We call them special concern. We have a different system. But globally, polar bears are also considered vulnerable species, which is the same as threatened. So we have concerns about the long-term status of the species. But again, there's a time frame here. And why 40 years? Well, we use what's called a 3-generation rule in looking at the sort of time frame for when any species is going to be at risk. And it doesn't matter if that's a bird or a butterfly or a polar bear. For polar bears, we're talking a generation length of about 12 to 13 years. And so we're talking 30 to 40 years in the future that we're really going to get concerned. But that doesn't mean we're not seeing changes now. So to touch on some of the things that make polar bears vulnerable, put it into perspective here. What is it about them that makes them sensitive to climate change? And one of the things to note is that the Arctic is warming somewhere between 3 to 4 times faster than lower latitude areas. So one of the things that's happening here is that the Arctic is just showing the signs of warming much faster. So we never designed our research programs to really study climate change, but we did have the data. And then once we got the satellite record, we could say, okay, the ice is changing, the bears are changing. We put it together. Yeah, you can see the effects. So an old painting, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, death, famine, war, and conquest. But for polar bears, it's a bit different. The threats are hunting, pollution, disease, and parasites. And of course, I would say by far the #1 threat is climate change going forward for polar bears. Disease is just a wild card. We know that polar bears are vulnerable to avian influenza, for example. We've had one known case of fatality that was attributed to avian influenza. Pollution Polar bears are at the top of the food chain, and most environmental pollutants from industrial agricultural activities, they bond onto fat. Polar bears are at the top of the food chain, high fat diet. They have, I've done a lot more work on pollution than I would ever really want to have, but they are affected for sure. Hunting is an ongoing challenge, but it's the one that we can actually control. If polar bear populations decline, Inuit will definitely cut back on their harvest. There's a good co-management system, so it's not one that I really worry about. So to put everybody at rest here tonight, there's still lots of polar bears out there. They're not all gone. And there's somewhere between 21,000, 25,000 across the Arctic. We don't really have a good estimate. This is kind of a seat of the pants estimate because we don't have inventory for many populations across the Arctic. And even then, when we do have estimates, some of these populations haven't been estimated for 10, 15 years. So it's always a bit of a caveat to say how many bears there are, but there's lots. And one thing to consider is that sometimes you'll see polar bears listed as the largest terrestrial carnivore. They're not terrestrial at all. This is a marine mammal, and they're classified as such in the United States and in some other jurisdictions. And so the simplest way to look at polar bears and global warming is it's just a habitat loss issue. The Arctic is warming. They rely on sea ice. The sea ice is disappearing. So it's a pretty simple scenario. And this is a bit of a cheater photo. This polar bears don't spend their time in the water like this very much. It was actually a cold day. She'd rather be out on the surface of the ice. I came along and a helicopter was going to catch her and put a radio collar on her. She jumped into this crack in the ice and just swam back and forth. So we tried scaring her out with the helicopter. And finally, I just took out my camera and took a picture of her, and we kept along our merry way. And we came back about an hour later and found her. So she was happy at that point to join our research program. So this is 1984. This is September. This is looking from the pole down on the Arctic, and this is the distribution of sea ice. So September is when sea ice in the Arctic reaches its minimum distribution. So if you look down in the bottom right there, you can see Hudson Bay, it's all ice-free. That's normal. But when I started studying polar bears in 1984, you could actually stand on the coast of the Yukon or Northwest Territories or Alaska, and you could see sea ice. And the polar bears were out there on the sea ice. It's not a great time for hunting seals because there's lots of open water, but the bears are out there and they didn't come on land. And so the change, though, this is 2012. This is what the sea ice looked like. Very far offshore, and there's a scale bar down in that bottom left corner that shows what 1,000 kilometers looks like. So now this is the minimum ice extent that we've had on record in September, but we've had many years, and all the low ice years have occurred since about 2010. So the conditions have vastly changed. And I don't know about you, but if you think about it from a polar bear perspective, we ask a polar bear that used to spend the summer right along the coast of Alaska, where all the seals live, because that continental shelf there is really tiny. If we now tell you, oh, you can't stay there because there's no habitat, you've got two choices. You can jump on land where there's nothing much to eat, or you can go north with the sea ice. And a lot of bears still go north with the sea ice and did do that in 2012. But I don't know about you, but if I walked probably an extra 1,000 kilometers northward and southward again, 2,000 kilometers a year, it's going to use up a lot more energy. And so from a lot of the perspectives about the changes in the environment, we're changing things that affect the energetics of the bears. How long do they have to go without feeding? How far do they have to walk? And how easy is it to catch a seal in these environments? So we're sort of coming down, moving through the talk. There's just a few more things here to talk about to put it into perspective. But when I started studying bears in 1980s, and earlier than that, this is what the Arctic looked like. January to December, there was ice. And that's just a sort of a simple perspective. There's a feeding period. The main one in the springtime when ring seals and bearded seals are giving birth to their pups and mating. Then the polar bears are also mating at that time. And then there's another smaller feeding period in December as the sea ice starts to reform. And then the bears have better access to areas where the seals are, and they get a smaller feeding period. So polar bears are incredibly well adapted to going for periods of time without food, but there are limits. I've already said that a female polar bear can go for 240 days without feeding, but she's going to burn up about 1 kilogram of body fat per day. And your average polar bear has nowhere near that amount of energy stored and cannot go that long. So the problem you've got is an adult male can burn up about 1.5 kilograms of body mass per day, a subadult somewhere around 800 grams. But you're burning up energy. If you're not eating, you're using up energy. And at some point, we just extending this fasting period with warming. And at some point, we're starting to clip off the spring feeding period. And we're also starting to edge out into some years, the ice isn't coming back till well in December. And we're starting to bump into that December feeding period as well. So the challenge for a polar bear is if they come ashore with a set amount of kilos, if they have 150 kilos of stored body fat, they can go easily 5 months. The problem becomes is once they go beyond their stored energy reserves, they no longer are in what we call a controlled fasting period. They're now moving into a starvation type event. And once they move into starvation, the challenge for the bears is that their physiology, just like any other animal, starts to go sideways and eventually they die. And I don't have time to go into it, but polar bears do some amazing things physiologically when they're not feeding. And one of the things they can do is they actually don't even urinate. They take the nitrogenous waste that would normally urinate out, and they actually recycle that back into essential amino acids and use it to build up their or keep their body muscle mass intact. And I mean, you think about it. I mean, hospital patients in a hospital bed without movement for months on end, their muscles atrophy, their bones atrophy. After 8 months in a hospital bed, a human wouldn't be able to move. A polar bear does that in a den, 8 months, comes out, starts hunting and walking long distances out over the sea ice. She's managed to maintain her muscle mass by recycling calcium, using a little bit for raising her cubs, but basically bones are intact, muscles are intact. She's just used up a lot of that energy reserve. There's only so far you can push that. So what's happening, sort of a synoptic view, climate warming, it's changing the sea ice. It means less food for the bears, increased movements, and a longer fasting period. This results in bears with lower body condition, fewer successful pregnancies, higher mortality, and we end up with population declines. So in essence, it's a pretty simple chain of events that's happening. There's other complexities here that we could talk about. We might be having more drowning events, but we're not really sure. It's really a hard thing to study and to quantify. But this is sort of the core fundamentals of how we view the changes. So there's lots of things changing in the Arctic. We've got sea ice loss. We're changing food webs. We're seeing increased conflicts with humans all across the Arctic. There's still very high demand for hunting by Inuit people in particular. We've got high levels of toxic chemicals, which also, I won't get into it, but that interacts with climate change in a not a very good way. We've got great interest in the Northwest Passage, offshore oil and gas development. I'm quite convinced that we will see more interest in parts of the Alaska coast with the change in the presidency in the United States. We have basically very little idea of what parasites and disease are going to do to polar bears. We know they're vulnerable to avian influenza. We know they're vulnerable to West Nile. So again, as the Arctic warms, we're seeing things like an advance of where biting insects are found. So mosquitoes are moving northwards, other biting insects, other parasites, new species with new diseases associated with them. So there's a lot of things that are changing that we're trying to monitor. So we have 19, now we just have a new population of polar bears that we've identified off of Southeast Greenland as well. But we don't have great data on a lot of areas. Those areas that are black, we just don't have good population data on what's happening. Um, we have two populations that are likely increasing. Why are they increasing? Because they were overhunted and now the harvest is brought into control and the populations are recovering. We have three populations that are declining in abundance: the southern Beaufort Sea off of Canada and Alaska, the western Hudson Bay centered off of Churchill, and the southern Hudson Bay in Ontario and Quebec. The southern Beaufort is down up to almost 50% in abundance. We're trying to do a new estimate in that area. Western Hudson Bay is down somewhere between 30 and 50%. Southern Hudson Bay, not quite as much. And again, we expect, though, that most polar bear populations over time will start to disappear, and particularly the ones at the southern edge of their range. And part of it is it depends on the rate of sea ice loss. So right now in Western Hudson Bay, going back to 1980, we're losing about 6 days of ice cover per decade. Now, if you go over to just north of Norway, that green area that says BS, that's the Barents Sea. That's where I studied polar bears when I worked out of Norway. That ecosystem is losing ice cover at the rate of 30 days per decade. And so this has now been going on for many decades. These ecosystems are just disappearing, changing rapidly. So I mean, this is a simplified cartoon version of a sea ice food web. Polar bears are the top predator. Again, the primary producers are associated with sea ice, and that's the normal Arctic sea ice, the ecosystem we have. Glaucous gulls are pretty common up there. All these species are associated with sea ice for the most part. And if we took away the sea ice or take it away, and we are losing it, we end up with an Arctic ice-free food web. And at that scale, we start to see species coming in from the North Atlantic, the North Pacific. We start to see the large baleen whales coming in. We're already seeing that. We're seeing sperm whales, fin whales moving into the Arctic as well. But the top predator is being, polar bears being replaced by killer whales. We are seeing these animals moving in. And why aren't they there now with ice? Well, that big dorsal fin on their back is really keeping them out of sea ice. The Arctic whales that exist in those environments now, which is the bowhead, the narwhal, and the beluga, they just have a dorsal ridge, and they can use that to actually break ice. They can come up under the ice and break it and get a breath of air. Killer whales are not nearly as well adapted. They will go into the ice, but they want it broken up. But as the ice disappears, they're increasing in abundance. And this is some work that was done by my colleagues in Winnipeg at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, just looking at observations of killer whales in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. And it's almost an exponential increase. And this has brought about some really interesting changes because the whales are coming in because there's no ice, but there's lots of food for them to eat. There's slow-moving Arctic whales, and there's also a lot of seals that are out in the middle of the ocean. Unlike, if you go down to British Columbia on the coast, you'll see harbor seals. They like to stay close to the rocks because they don't like killer whales, and they don't want to get eaten. But in the Arctic, those seal species are out in the middle of the open ocean. They don't come near shore, and there's no anti-predator response because the predator they're worried about and evolved to avoid are polar bears. The summer means there's no polar bears because there's no ice, but now they've got killer whales. So they will come in. This is actually a group of whales that got locked into the ice off of the coast of Quebec. We don't even know if they ever got out, but they got trapped by some rapidly moving ice. And so they don't really want to be there, and they're having a hard time getting out. But as the Arctic is changing, we're seeing ecosystems in flux. And we know that these killer whales are killing bowhead whales, which is a very large whale. And one of the offshoot benefits is they can't eat all of the whales, so they snack on them. Then the whales are dead. They float up on shore, And at least for this transition period, these bears are getting access to this new bonus source of food. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. Polar bears behaviorally are really flexible. A lot of these are big adult males. If this was during the breeding season, they would be tearing each other apart for trying to get breeding opportunities with an estrus female. At this time of year, there's lots for everybody, so just share alike. They actually become quite social at this time of the year. The other things that are changing is we're starting to see more and more interactions with humans. Um, Arctic communities have very poor control over their waste, garbage. It's usually just open landfills. Sometimes they try to cover them. Bears are commonly coming into those areas, which brings them in close to communities. Once they're in close to communities, a lot of people have country food, so they might have caribou or seals or whale meat stored around their properties. And you don't have to put it into a freezer because it's probably minus 25, 30 degrees out. But the bears come in and now we've got a conflict. So there's a lot of these sorts of problems that we have. And this is across the Arctic. It doesn't matter which of the 5 nations we look at that have polar bears, we're seeing these sorts of problems. When you get these bears changing their distribution, changing in response to sea ice patterns, in 2018, we had 2 fatalities in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. And this is a real problem for northern communities. Polar bears are becoming less predictable where they are. We've had problems in Quebec in the middle of winter, people moving around their community. You got to remember, it's 24 hours or almost 24 hours of darkness in these communities. And if we start to get bears attracted into these places, it's a huge risk factor for local people. And I think most of us would agree, you really don't want to be waking up tomorrow morning, taking your children or grandchildren to school, and you don't expect to walk into a grizzly bear in where you're living. But that is a reality for a lot of northern people now, where more and more bears are spending longer and longer on time. They're in poorer condition. And a skinny bear is a dangerous bear. A fat bear, polar bears are not, they're not a problem. They're not a threat. So we still have increased harvest pressure in these northern communities. Right now, polar bear hides are not trading for high value, but a hide like this is probably worth $1,000 or $2,000 to the hunter, and we trade those internationally. A lot of them end up going to China, some to Russia. Some are sold locally. A lot of local people are also using the hides as sleeping skins. This bear is also going to be fed on by people in the communities. One of the real delicacies in Inuit culture is actually the polar bear pads on their feet. A lot of the elders really like eating them, and they have special fatty acids in their feet to keep the feet from freezing. And apparently, I've never had that. I've eaten polar bear, but I actually ate part of this one because I know the hunter. But anyways, the long and short story of it is this is an important day for this community. So to sort of wrap up, as cub production is going to decline, as the sea ice declines, and ultimately, if there's no ice, there's just no ice bear. The Arctic is going to have sea ice for at least to the end of the century. We don't look any longer than the end of the century. But the big problem is the only solution is reducing greenhouse gases. And I know it's Alberta. We rely heavily on oil and gas. I mean, I've got heat in my house. I drive a car. But over the longer term, we really have to look for solutions that reduce greenhouse gases in the environment. And we have to learn to live in better balance with this planet. And I come back to it. At some point, there's a limit to how many people we can put on this planet, and everybody would like a North American lifestyle. But if we all got there, 9 billion of us, I don't think there's going to be much space for polar bears going forward. There just won't be enough ice for them. So in essence, that's 41 years of polar bear research in summary. I could go on for hours and hours, but I won't. It is a Wednesday night and it is getting on in the evening. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a pretty awesome presentation and fascinating facts and observations too. And I'm just looking at the chat. Oh, I think my mouse isn't moving too good here to see if we have any questions. Just lots of thanks for the presentations. They mentioned about that Rhodes Scholar hostel for tours. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, so that's run through the Churchill Northern Study Center, or CNSC. That's the base of operations we work out of. It's called the Elder Hostel, and they run programs from there. And they basically have a bit of classroom learning about polar bears, and then they get out on a tundra buggy. It's a really nice facility. It's not super cheap to go, but there are other ways to go. I mean, you can get out onto the sea or onto the tundra buggies, but then you're starting to talk about the many, many, many thousands of dollars in terms of getting out there. It's just amazing. I go out on the tundra buggies and do a lot of media outreach. I actually did interviews with Martha Stewart out on the tundra buggies um, Hudson Bay once, and it was really fun. We were out there, and she flew up in her jet, and she was doing a show from there, and it was really fun. We were out on the tundra buggies, and then she says, "Does anybody want a sandwich?" And I'm thinking, "Oh, how fun is that? Martha Stewart is going to make me a sandwich, and I can watch polar bears from a tundra buggy." That was pretty sweet. So yeah, so it's a really interesting place. It's by far the best place to go to see polar bears. You can take a train to Churchill if you got lots of time. It's an interesting trip through the boreal forest. You can go all the way from Winnipeg if you really are, if you like train travel, or there are jet flights. I'm going up. I'll be up there in April, working from the study center. The elder hostels are sort of late October and into early November. I don't know if they
Awesome.
call them elder hostels now. I got to be careful as a senior citizen. It sounds kind of derogatory, but it's not. They're really good, and several of my colleagues have lectured there over time, and they bring in people, and it's pretty neat operation.
Okay, thank you